Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Welcome again to our monthly series of webinars. Today we're going to be focusing on managing library and archive collections within Vernon. So Vernon CMS is designed to handle any kind of specialist collection. It might be sports equipment, it might be natural sciences collections, and reference libraries and archives are two examples of those. There's a number of features within Vernon CMS to support those two specific collection types. So I'll be walking you through a few examples of those today. So our demonstration version of Vernon has a small collection of a few hundred objects that are catalogued, and that does include some examples of a reference library and a few archive items. The first thing that we have that's specific to those two collections are the custom screens specific to library and to archive series and file and item. So you can just access those on the left, and they just provide you a view of a subset of the object fields that are most relevant to those two types of collections. So I'm already in the object library collection screen, and I could do a simple search at the top. So maybe I'm looking for all of the books that include the word tail. And it's found several of those, and so I could bring those open. And so we can see on this custom screen that there's a few fields that we wouldn't see by default in our general identification screen. Those include who was the publisher of this particular item, and it also includes some fields which are generally available in the identification screen, but have been given clearer labels on the library screen to make it obvious what type of information you're supposed to be recording there. So there's a general production place field in Vernon, and that's been labelled as publication place here. Likewise, we've got a primary maker field, and that's where for library collections, you would record things such as the author, the editor, the illustrator, and we've noted that in the label of that field. Like many of the fields in Vernon, that particular field is in a table where you can have repeating entries. So you could record several different people that were involved in the production of this particular library item. The ISBN number is also available as a specific field. And then we've got a planned enhancement to Vernon where we'll be adding call number as a new table field within Vernon so that you can record multiple call numbers that are specific to this particular library book. At the moment, people are recording call number in the other ID table. So that's one of the fields that are available on the screen. We can see that we've currently noted that call number is something that you could record in other ID, but in the future there'll be a dedicated field for recording multiple entries of that. And that's something that came out of our recent library and archives online discussion that we held. So in the same way, we have dedicated screens for archives. But archives are special in that you often record a hierarchy of records depending on what resources you have to catalogue those items at a particular level. So initially you might have a set of archives and all you have time to do is to record an overarching description of that particular series of material. So an archive series would be a group of items that have a set of information in common that maybe come from a particular source and they cover the same subject material. So the archive series window is where you create that broadest level of record. And again, I have some examples of that already in the system. So if I do a search for Johnston, we can see that I already have a series record and already we've catalogued a number of items that fit within that series. So let's just open the series record. The generic field in Vernon for the level of the current object record is where you note the level of this particular record. So here we're describing that highest level, a series, and so we want to make that clear and we enter it into the level field. And then many of the other fields that we record are just general fields that you would use for all types of collection items. So what department it belongs to, the number it's been allocated, the date range that applies to that. And then on the second page, we might have other material. For an archive series, you might have, for instance, a PDF file, which just gives a textual summary of that whole archive. So using the general external file field, we could link other files like that help describe this item. So you might link to a related PDF file, for example. Once we've recorded a series, you might at a later date have time to record individual folders that are within those boxes or individual items at the lowest level. We can see that this particular series has 3 member records that have already been created, and there's a shortcut to view those members. So if I click on that button, it will jump across to the second screen that we've got that is specific to archive collections, and that's the archive file item screen. So some of our clients only record a 2-level structure. They would have series, and then they would have items within that, and that's what we've followed in our demo system. But the system supports any number of levels. So if you've got particularly rich, complex archives, you might have a 3-level structure where you've got series, which represents perhaps a number of boxes of similar material. You might then have files or folders that are within those, which are subsets of that material. And then finally, you might have the item records. And each of those 3 levels will be clearly noted in the level field. So we can see now that we're viewing an item level record. Some of the information at this level is now getting more specific. So we've got the standard image thumbnail, for instance, because at the item level, you might be photographing these particular items. We might be giving specific subject categories down at the item level. And we might be amending some of the things like the restrictions and the conditions around the use of this material. Lastly, we also have an accessory screen. So that's not too commonly used within libraries and archives, but an example would be a dust jacket of a library item. You might want to document as its own record if it's particularly important. So it might be a rare dust jacket, and you've got details of who actually created the illustration on that, and you want to link it back to the book that's currently using that dust jacket. I've got one example of those catalogued. So I've got this dust jacket, and we can see there's a related item. So it's linked to the book, which is currently using that accessory. So the accessory window is used for describing anything which isn't a formal legal part of your collection, but you're still wanting to track in some detail. Other types of collections that use this screen are things like art collections, where they might have projectors for digital artworks, and they need to track those projectors, or plinths that a statue might sit on, or any kind of collection item where there's a complex frame or container which you're tracking within the collection. The accessory window always lets you relate that item to one or more objects in the collection, and you can be time specific. So that dust jacket might have only been used for this book for a certain period, and then perhaps the book went out of your collection, but you still hold the dust jacket as part of your own kind of history and archives. All of that information is then searchable in the same way that we do for any kind of object. So if we go to the advanced search, things that are particularly useful are the object type field. So as you're cataloguing that material, you might be marking all the things which are books as opposed to periodicals, and you'd be able to search using object type to find just a specific subset. The department field is the broadest category that we have available within the object records. So you may create a department term for library and for archives, so that you've got an easy way to grab all of the records that fit into that particular category. There's also a format field where you can be more specific as to what kind of format that material is in. And of course, you can search on the level field. So I could, for instance, pull out all the archive items by just searching on level of item and then finding those particular records. Some of the other specific fields for those collections are also available. So publisher is another example. So if we look in all the person fields that are under this group, we'll see publisher as one of the items. So I could just do a search just like I would do on any other person field, and I know the name of one publisher. And I've found 4 books that relate to that. And then I can come back to the library screen where I started off. And so these 4 books are all done by Grosset and Dunlop. As well as documenting things at the record level, you can also describe parts that make up that particular item. We do have some clients that use the part field for documenting the particular issues that they have of a periodical. So you can use the cataloging screen for library to describe a particular periodical, for example, the New Zealand Women's Weekly. And then you can use the parts field, which we can see here is labeled as part/holding, to describe the individual issues that you're using. So that's useful if you're not wanting to go into the detail of cataloguing each individual issue separately. You just want to have a list of what issues are available within your holdings, and you might just list those one after the other, saying, well, we hold August 2020, August 2021, and November 2022. The point at which it becomes useful to create separate catalogue records for each of those issues is when you're wanting to describe those in more detail. So if you're wanting to describe the individual articles that were in each of those issues, describe what authors were present in those articles, for instance, you're not going to be able to do that within one single record just by listing parts. It's going to get too complex to say, these are all the details that relate to 100 different issues that we hold of this periodical. So that's a judgment call on your side as to how far you want to go into the detail of those individual issues. As well as the parts for describing subsets of that item, we can also connect it to other items within our collection. And so that's done through the standard group and member screen. And so that's what the archive concept is using. The archive screens just provide a shortcut to access the fields that are linking those different record types. So the next higher record field is where an archive item links up to an archive series. And we saw an example of the related record concept being used to link a dust jacket to a particular book. But that might be any kind of relationship. You might have other books in the same series and you could relate them through the related object field. So some of these concepts also flow through to when we present the information to the public. So one of our Melbourne sites is the Johnston Collection. And so they've split up their online records into 2 broad categories. The first is their general permanent collection, which is primarily social history and art. And then they've also split it into a second half of their reference library. Vernon Browser allows you to be specific as to what information is published for different record types. And so on this site, they present quite different information for the library records than they do for the social history and art items. And we can see those kind of fields that were present on the catalogue record, things like the people that produced it, the production place, and so on. And so each of those records will have details. So that's an example of a library collection that's in Vernon. The Fletcher Trust Archives is an Auckland site, and that's a large corporate archive. And so this is a case where all of their records are archive type records. They don't hold any other collection types. I could do a search on all of the records they have, and we can see that they've published that level field. So you can always be clear as to whether you're viewing a series record that describes a group of material or just a specific item. So let's see just the records in their collection that have images. These will all be item levels. So if I go into one of these, they also publish the links between the records. So I'm viewing a particular item. We can see some of those details that we saw on the archive item screen back in Vernon. And we can see the series record. So that's that next higher record that's connecting this particular item back up to the broader series record. So I could click on that link and I'll see the general information that they've summarized for that series. And now I see the reverse. I'm seeing the link back to all of the items that have so far been catalogued within that particular series. for library items, we also support bringing in MARC format library records from other systems. And that's something that several of our sites use to speed up their cataloguing process. So for example, the National Library's Tapuna website has a subscription service, so that's a paid service, but as part of that service, you can do things like discover collections on there, and then there's tools where you can download their catalogue records. So you can do a search within a website for a particular publication, and if it's one that they've already catalogued, then you can download their catalogue record and import the basic information from there as your base record in Vernon. So I'll just show an example of that import process. So that's done through our XML Import screen. And the system comes pre-built with an XML configuration for MARC format. I've already set up this copy of the system to by default look for a file which I've called marcrecord.txt. And so that's a MARC record that I've already downloaded in advance earlier today. You can decide whether the information in that record is going to get added into an existing record that you already have, or whether you're creating a brand new record. So I'll say that I'm not going to match to an existing record. I'm going to make a brand new record for this particular item that I've downloaded. So now when I click on import, it'll go through that data and it'll make sure that all of it is valid according to the settings that you have in your system. As part of that process, there will be some extra information you have to create. And so we've come across an example already of that the primary maker for that particular book is not one that's represented in the person file of the system. So Vernon can't automatically create that. It needs to take care that it's not creating duplicates, that there's not already maybe a Christopher instead of a Chris, which is the same person. So it gives you options to search for the correct matching record or to go and create a new term in that file. So in this case, I'll just create a new term because I know that I don't have Carl Sandburg in the system. And then I can say, well, if you encounter any more cases of that in the rest of this import, what will we do? I'll say, well, anytime we find that same name, we're just going to use the new term that I've just created. And so that's now finished. And I could say that I'm wanting to open that up as a list. There was only one record in that MARC file. And I could open that up in a window. And so that has brought in the basic information about that record. That / that we've got there is part of the title that was in that particular MARC record. So we can see we've already filled in a lot of basic information. We've got the maker, we've got which institution controls that, the collection, description, and so on. So that's useful if you've got some kind of partner like Tapuna who has catalogued some of the things that might already appear within your own collection. Because that's using XML Import, you can also have fine control over exactly which fields you do want to import and whereabouts in Vernon that goes to. So each individual site has slightly different cataloging rules and has made slightly different use of the fields that are available in the system. So the default import settings might not be exactly what you need, but they're things that can easily be tailored, and that's something that we can help you with. If I do a search for a set of library records again, I'll find those same books that included the word tail. We have library and archive specific features as part of our reporting tool. If I go into reporting and choose to create a new report, the XML report option is one that creates structured data that another system can understand. And that's how that MARC import is working. That websites like Tapuna are creating structured data which Vernon can then later understand. And you might be doing the reverse. You want to export some data about your library records to a different system which can understand XML data. So in the XML format screen, you'll see that there's some formats that are specific to library and archives. So we can take archive records and put them into encoded archival description format. And then we can also take library records and use Lido format and RDA format, which are both used within the library industry. So that's just a couple of examples of how we can take the raw data that's in Vernon and convert it to an international standard for use in some other kind of project. Thanks everyone for your time today.